Willie Sutton, that famous mid-century bank robber, was once asked why he robs banks, to which he famously replied, "Because that's where the money is." Now, Willie wasn't wrong, but he was only half right. Because back at the turn of the last century, the really big money, the big scores were in payroll robberies, not bank robberies. Just do the math. A big mine might have 500 employees. Each one makes $20 a week. In today's money, that's $300,000 in cash, and it would be in cash because everyone insisted on being paid in cash, down at the mine every Friday, ripe for the picking. Why do you think Butch and Sundance always robbed those trains? Because that's how payroll moved. The big banks in St. Louis and Denver would ship the payroll to little towns like Black Rock, Montana to pay the miners. What it amounted to was millions of dollars in cash moving around the country constantly, just ready to be stolen. Hi, I'm the 100 Proof News Hound here with another episode of the 100 Years and More Show. Make sure you like and subscribe. Subscriptions especially are important for the growth of the channel, so hit that button right now. Today we're going to tell you the story of payroll robbers. Not just payroll robbery, but how they changed our relationship with money and changed the way, forced the change in the way America banks. Now let's get started. Why don't we go back to Butch and Sundance and see what they're doing back in 1897. Headline in the Salt Lake Tribune, April 22nd, 1897. Headline is Big Haul. Bold robbery by desperados at Castle Gate. Got a bag of gold. 7,000 secured. Well, what happened here? Well, it says Mr. Carpenter had just arrived in Castle Gate with money for the payment of the Pleasant Valley Company's miners. Two men, we'll see who they are in a second. Two men ordered him and the 10 men helping him to raise their hands. And then in front of about 100 people in the middle of town, they made away with a sack of gold valued at $7,000, which is $210,000 in current money. So quite a haul. And it says here that the robbery occurred in broad daylight and was one of the most daring affairs ever recorded. It is stated that the robbers had not yet been captured, but they were sure that one of them was Butch Cassidy. We're unclear as whether the Sundance Kid was with him at that time, but Butch was. He knew where the easy money was, and the easy money was in the transshipment points between train and mine, or the bank to the train, and that's the area that they worked. Now, the most famous of the payroll robberies of the late 19th century was an episode called the Wham Paymaster Robbery. Now, it wasn't named after like Whammo sporting goods or anything. Wham was the name of the paymaster employed by the American government. Here's the headline of the Indianapolis News, May 13th, 1889. In the Apache country, a United States paymaster robbed on a lonely trail. Says that a sharp engagement terminated in the officer's surrender. The sum of money lost is $29,000. That's about $900,000. Little chance of its recovery. Says here that Major J. Wham, United States paymaster, accompanied by his clerk, W.T. Gibbons, left here last Wednesday on a trip to pay the troops stationed at Forts Bowie, Grant, Thomas, San Carlos, and Apache. They went by rail to Wilcox and from there went by wagon overland. The funds paid in his departure are in account of the security for the short of it is they had to use gold because there weren't any greenbacks. There was no cash money available, so they had to use gold. Now, it says the initial amount that they had was $75,000, but they had made payments to 3 other forts and they were down to $29,000 at the time of the attack. It says here the guards rode, let's state what we have here. We have the paymaster, his assistant, we have 2 sergeants, and we have 10 Buffalo soldiers, 10 black cavalry from the 10th Cavalry Division. Both of the sergeants are also black. So they've been chosen because they are crack troops and apparently extremely brave. That's what it says. It says here the distance from Fort Grant to Fort Thomas is 35 miles through a mountainous and uninhabited country. Perfect place to have an ambush. The scene was actually the subject of a painting by Remington, which we have a copy of here. We should be able to show it to you right now. It was a classic ambush. It says it was at this point 3 miles north of Cedar Springs in a deep, narrow gorge that Major Wham was attacked. As the party approached the point, they found the road obstructed by several large rocks. Several of the escort got out of their wagons, leaving their guns behind them, and proceeded to remove the rocks from the road. As they gathered around a large boulder, a galling fire came pouring down from the cliffs and breastworks. So they're now under attack. It says here, the battle continued for half an hour, But seeing that the robbers were completely protected, they're behind cover, behind the rocks and such, and it meant certain death for his entire party if he was forced to yield to their demands. And the box of coins was taken with containing approximately $29,000 in gold. Now, who did this heinous crime? Initially, it said it is thought that the robbers were led by two old offenders recently pardoned from the penitentiary, the most desperate men of their kind in the South. There will be desperate fighting before they are retaken. It turns out that the actual perps, well, it says the suspected ringleader was Gilbert Webb, who was also the serving mayor of Pima and a leading member of the Graham County Democratic Party. He was held in high regard with the Mormon community due to jobs he provided through his various businesses. So it was kind of an inside job with one of the leading lights of the community. There was a trial. There was ample evidence to get a conviction on Webb and a few of the other fellows, but you can't. It's hard to get a conviction in the Old West. There's more distrust of government than there is distrust of bandits. So he walked. But one thing that did happen out of this, in recognition of their extreme bravery, Sergeant Benjamin Brown and Corporal Isaiah Mays were both awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor as a result of their actions in the gunfight here in the Wham attack. Let's look at the logistics here for a second about how you carry on robberies at this point in time. You know, in the 19th century, if you rob a payroll or a train, if you're whatever, you're escaping by horse. If you rob a bank or a payroll in town, your options are limited to by foot or maybe a bicycle. All that's about to change right around 1905 with the coming of the automobile. Now you can escape on a pre-chosen route at 30 to 40 miles per hour, and it's a game changer in the big score arena here. Now let's look at your options here. Do you want to rob a bank or do you want to rob a payroll? Now, we've got an interesting photograph here showing a 1925 bank robbery. Let's have a look at what the scene is in here. You've got two men perpetrating the robbery, one with a shotgun, one with a revolver. There are 21 people in this bank that they have to control. There are 9 people, there are 9 clerks. All of them, 9 clerks across the front, 2 on the side, 11 clerks that have by now, each of them have triggered the silent alarm, which has sent a signal to the police station. And because this, we'll look at it, it's a big downtown branch, how far are they from the police station? I'll give you 6 blocks. So they've got to perpetrate their robbery, control the 21 people, get back out the front door into their Model T and get away at 30 to 40 miles an hour, all in about 2.5 minutes before the police show up. There are a lot of moving parts. Even once you're out of the bank, you're subject to traffic. You could be involved in an accident. God knows what could happen. It's a complicated, dangerous situation. Now let's look at the next photograph. This is a photograph of the Packard plant in Detroit that was built in 1905. By 1910, 1915, it looks the same way. Look where it's placed. Look where it's positioned. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing around it. The nearest police station is going to be 5 miles away. What it does have, it has roads, because you need roads to get your employees in and to get your product out. So it's going to have good roads, good highways. You're stranded out there in the middle of nowhere, and every weekend, if there's 1,000 people employed at this plant, there's going to be the equivalent of $750,000 in cash out there every Friday. Now, which one, if you're a criminal mastermind, which of these two projects would you want to undertake? Obviously, it's the payroll, and to such an extent that in 1917, it's a thing. It's a thing that the public is extremely concerned about. Here's an article in the Dayton Daily News, Dayton, Ohio, Sunday, June 17th, 1917. The headline is Payroll Robberies Deluxe. They're looking at the phenomena of the major payroll robbery. And what it says here, says the number of payroll robberies is increasing due to the better means of escape than was formerly offered. When a thief had to depend on snatching a payroll and escaping down a congested street, he thought long and hard before he snatched. But with the opportunity afforded by the automobile, he's become bold and brazen. A robber or robbers can knock down a man, grab the payroll, dash down the street in an automobile, change license numbers, and effect an escape much more easily than when he had to depend either upon the fleetness of foot or the speed of his bicycle. They note that within the last week, in Detroit, there was a payroll robbery where $37,000 was taken. It says in the car was $37,000. This was a weekly occurrence, and no more trouble was anticipated on this trip than on the hundreds of previous ones. The company knew, however, that such a large payroll could not help but attract attention, so they had an armed guard But it didn't matter, because what you're going to see time and time again, when push comes to shove, the armed guard is much more concerned about his own personal safety than he is about guarding the $37,000. And that $37,000 is like $1.1 million, and that's gone. The article recognizes the fallibility of even the best intentioned private security guard, and throws out the possibility that you've got to the only way of dealing with this problem is to get away from the use of cash in negotiating people's salaries, that it should be done in checks. But we'll be getting into the problems associated with that in a moment. Now, to give you an example, to give you a representative example of what was going on in America at the time, I've chosen a month, almost by random, and that month is August of 1921. And let's see what was going on in August of 1921. All of these occurrences occurred in that one single month. Now here's an article, San Francisco Examiner, August 19th, 1921, scenes and figures in payroll robbery. It says 7 masked auto bandits get $9,600, which is the equivalent of about $300,000 in payroll holdup. They have a nice quasi-animated cartoonish photograph here showing how the perpetrator's vehicle cut off the payroll vehicle and forced them to stop and affected their robbery. Then we have here in the St. Louis Star-Times of Friday, August 5th, 1921, $15,000 payroll robbery. Well, let's do the math. That's a $450,000 payroll robbery. 6 armed men held up the paymaster of the Barrett Manufacturing Company at Shadyside today. Sounds like a nice place to work. And escaped with the payroll. Cash between $15,000 and $25,000. So that's between $450,000 and $750,000, according to the report received by the prosecutor. So a $750,000 robbery occurs in St. Louis. Wasn't always easy, though. Sometimes the police get involved, and sometimes the security guards are a little braver than you think. Here's the Marion Star, Marion, Ohio, August 27th, 1921. Bandit dies in gun battle. Posse overtakes robber near Morgantown today. Fight follows payroll robbery. 3 bandits secure $28,000. Greater part of the loot was found on the dead man. Great name, great word, loot. Don't use that enough. What happened here is they robbed the payroll. They accosted one of the clerks, injured him, fled. A gun battle ensued. 1 was killed. 2 have escaped, but they've got the money back. It's not always clean and easy, but as we've said before, it's still safer than robbing banks. But sometimes a robbery can have a comic quality. Now here we have, headline, hold up at Ryan. It's the Leader Telegram, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, August 21, 1921. Hold up at Ryan Hotel thwarted. Masked bandits' bold attempt to get $6,000 payroll foiled by auditor. So $6,000 again is almost $200,000. Foiled by auditor. What did he do? It says an armed masked payroll bandit made an unsuccessful attempt to hold up Paul Noak, Ryan Hotel auditor, in his office in the rear of the hotel lobby shortly before 8 a.m. today. Noak's presence of mind saved $180,000 in cash on hand for payment of employees' wages and several $1,000s belonging to guests when the bandit was put to flight without obtaining any loot. What he did is the bandit pulled the gun out, pointed at him, and the clerk just dove through a hole in the back of his little cubicle out into the lobby, where he rounded up about 25 guys who all came running towards the bandit, who busted out the back door into the alley and just fled. And was, as far as we know, was never heard from again. So robberies don't always end successfully, and sometimes they don't end tragically. Sometimes they end farcically. Now, here's an article from the New York Herald, August 27th, 1921, and they're describing 2 payroll robberies here. The small one was a small one of about $35,000, and a major one of about $210,000. And it says here, payroll bandits committed 2 holdups yesterday. It says the larger one was from the Auto Strop Razor Company. It says in the latter crime, an elevator operator who tried to prevent the robbery was shot in the side but not seriously wounded. What happened was that they went to get the payroll for the Razor Company down at the bank. When they got back to the building, they entered the elevator. When the 2 clerks entered the elevator, 3 men entered the elevator, drew their weapons. There was a fight inside the elevator. The elevator operator was wounded, and they've got away with the money, and it'll never be seen again. But again, it's $210,000. Now, it's in today's money. All they had to do was step into an elevator and pull guns. It's so, the reward is so disproportionate to the risk that it invites attempts by even petty criminals. Now, as we said, they're not all successful. And here's one that was tripped up by a waitress. Here we go. The Evening Review, East Liverpool, Ohio, August 1st, 1921. Believe police raid thwarted holdup plot. Cleveland waitress tip results in arrest of 9 men. Overheard plan to seize Amherst Payroll. She was waiting on these people, and the knuckleheads were talking about the heist they were going to pull, and they were specific about who they were going to rob, and they were specific about the fact that there was going to be $24,000, which is the equivalent of about $700,000 there when they robbed it. She immediately called the police, who came there and arrested them, and all the men were armed. There was like 11 automatic pistols, two automobiles were also seized by the police. They were actually getting ready to go pull the payroll robbery, and the waitress thwarted their endeavor. Now, there was a famous, well, it got a lot of play in Memphis, Tennessee. Headline, The American Guardian, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, August 10th, 1921. Bandit kills 2 in attempt to get Ford money. There was a Ford motor plant in Memphis at the time. They tried to rob the payroll. There were 4 in they referred to as an 8-cylinder car. I believe it was a Cadillac. They immediately opened fire on the payroll clerks, killing 1 Ford employee and killing a police officer. And that's what got the nation upset about this. Killing police officers violates social norms, and it won't be tolerated by society. This was a crazy thing as well, because a posse was formed chasing the bandits. The citizens fired upon what they thought was the perp's vehicle, but it turned out to be a police vehicle, and 2 more police officers were injured. Eventually, the money was eventually recovered. People were tried, if you want to get a nation enraged, kill police officers. That, at least traditionally, that's been the result of such actions. Now, payrolls continue to be robbed. Remember, this is just 1 month. We're still in August 1921. St. Louis Post-Dispatch, August 30th, 1921. $1.3 million, and I'm doing the math so you don't have to, payroll robbery, suspect arrested in raid. Says Thomas Hayes taken in Westgate Avenue apartment with a young woman. Sometimes a crime is pure melodrama. Listen to all the innuendos and such that are dropped here. Here we go. Detectives forced their way into an apartment at 1719 Westgate Avenue, University City, at 8:30 a.m. today, and arrested Thomas Hayes, 27-year-old, charged in a warrant with participating in the $46,000 Standard Oil payroll robbery at Wood River, Illinois, August 4th. Also arrested was Miss Margaret McDonald, 21, who occupied a room in the apartment. Very platonic, obviously. It says here, Hayes, who was hurriedly donning his clothing, reached for an why is he donning his clothing? Reached for an automatic pistol, which was beneath a pillow on the bed of the room. Special Officer Adams beat him to the weapon, and in a struggle which followed, Chief Hoagland struck Hayes several times in the head with his revolver, inflicting deep scalp wounds. So we got women shacking up with criminals. This is like a scene out of a Dillinger movie. Now, sometimes the perpetrators are just incredibly successful and recover incredible amounts of money. And here we go. All again in August of 1921, the Commercial Appeal, Memphis, Tennessee. Auto bandits seize $114,000, which is $4.5 million. Thieves make escape. Money for mining villages taken by 4 men from a party of 10 at Kincaid, Illinois. Cashier struck over the head. There were 10 guards. 4 criminals. Again, you just lay down your arms. You don't want to get involved in the Memphis thing where it's like a gun battle out of a movie. In most cases, the guards will just give up, and they did that here. It says here, the Peabody Coal Company offices at Kincaid, Illinois, stated late tonight that the amount of the payroll stolen there was actually $135,000. So let's make that $5 million they got away with. The money was to cover 2 weeks' wages at 4 large mines operated by the Peabody Company near Kincaid. And that's what we said. Do the math. The math is so overwhelmingly in favor of robbing payrolls that it's kind of not comprehensible why people would even try to rob banks. How much of a pandemic were we having here? Here's an article. We're finally out of August 1921. But here we are a couple years later, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, November 19th, 1923. $163,000 stolen in 67 payroll robberies in St. Louis in the last 3 years. That's $5 million, okay? They've lost $5 million in pure payroll robberies just in St. Louis. But then it says nearly $15 million taken from business concerns here and in East St. Louis and in neighboring communities. So if you go metro, the Metro St. Louis area, they've lost $15 million in the last 3 years in payroll robberies just in St. Louis. And I bet you've never even heard of a payroll robbery, but that's how predominant, that's how common they were back then in the 1920s. It says here, the newspaper interviews the police chief, and the police chief has some ideas about how you could lessen the chances of there being a payroll robbery. And his idea basically predates the famous Archie Bunker solution when he's asked about what he would do to stop hijackings to Cuba in 1971 when they were happening all the time. His idea was to arm the passengers, which might work. But here's what the police chief said in St. Louis. Employees of the company should be sworn in as watchmen so that they can carry revolvers, Chief of Police O'Brien has declared. Such guards should walk behind the paymaster or across the street from him so that they can be as ready as possible to shoot anyone attempting to hold him up. Now, he's talking about just giving guns to regular employees. Just the fact you call them watchmen doesn't mean they're proficient in the use of firearms. I would feel a heck of a lot better if you were hiring ex-Navy SEALs or someone of that caliber to accompany the payrolls downtown. But to just arm the average citizen, you might be asking for a little more action than you want. Then he gets into some tactics here. He says most people make the mistake when they walk along the side and chat with them. So he's saying that most of the guards just walk around and chat, but that's no good because you can get surprised. What you should do is walk a little behind him or across the street so that the bad guys don't know who's providing cover for the man, and they'll be reluctant to steal the payroll because they know someone around there is within 100 feet going to start shooting at him. It seems insane, and it probably is. That I don't think that was ever a rational way to lessen the problem caused by payroll robberies. And on a national level, let's have a look here. We got the Morning Union, Springfield, Massachusetts, November 1, 1926. It says that in the last year, doing the math for you, $120 million was stolen in payroll robberies, $120 million. But more importantly, 20 persons were killed and 40 wounded. What are we in Vietnam? The carnage is incredible. There has to be something done. There has to be something done at some time to lessen or prevent these actions. It's really gotten out of hand. And talking about getting out of hand, one of the things they talk about as a cure for all of this sort of thing is the armored car. The armored car comes along in the early 1920s. It's a product of World War I. They're not to the Brinks trucks yet, but they are an armored car. What they say is that an armored car, even if you don't have to have a lot of courage to drive your armored car past the payroll robbers or over the payroll robbers. Armored car is seen as kind of a panacea. And that sort of works a bit until 1927 when a fellow by the name of Paul Jaworski takes the next logical step, gets some dynamite and blows up the armored car, then walks in over the dead bodies and takes the money. Here we have the headline of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, March 17, 1927. Headline, it says here, farm owner gives plan for the $140,000 pay theft. Someone knew about Paul Jaworski, this is the fellow's name, and turned him in. It says here, Jaworski is facing 2 charges of murder. It says, Jaworski was the leader of a gang with 3 or 4 other guys that were also responsible for 3 or 4 other crimes. It says here the headline of the Pittsburgh Post, March 17, 1927, Bandit's sister visits him, gets all into the melodrama. The police chief and the chief investigator are shaking hands, congratulate themselves, and they note that the $104,000 payroll, that's what was stolen, that's almost $3.5 million, resulted in 2 deaths, and that that Jaworski and his pals are responsible for 3 other robberies in which 2 pay guards, that's what they call security personnel, were murdered. And it was believed, the whole series of crimes were believed to be solved yesterday because Paul Jaworski actually confessed, and $33,000, which is equivalent to about $1 million in banknotes and 3 large bags of silver were found on his farm. So payroll robberies by 1927 are still first and foremost in the public's mind. They're resulting in tremendous loss of life as well as loss of property. Here's an editorial from the Houston Post on January 30th, 1929. Payroll robberies. It says here, for a country that has looked with disdain upon the bandit-infested nations such as Bulgaria, Turkey, and Mexico, with apologies to the Bulgarians, Turks, and Mexicans, isn't it rather humiliating for the United States to have let the world know that our National Crime Commission has deemed it necessary to appoint a commission of 19 men to study the problem of payroll robberies and to recommend solutions? So the federal government has actually appointed a commission to look into this phenomenon of payroll robberies and come up with some solutions. And it goes on that here in the most civilized and most enlightened nation in the world, according to Americans, industry becomes such a flourishing industry that business firms face the menace of attack upon their agents while carrying funds for the regular payment of employees. And not just in the remote deserts or remote mountain passes do these payroll robberies occur, but right in downtown, right outside your office, right at the factories. They note that the solution to payroll robberies that seems the most ideal for employees is to pay the employees with checks and thus avoid transferring large sums of cash through city streets. There are problems. The article notes that there are some problems with respect to that, some you might not expect. One was back in the 1920s, certain ethnic groups, Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, and blacks had a real distrust of banks. Now, and not without good reason. You know, the Thurston Howell the thirds of the world who ran the national banking system at that point in time kind of looked at those groups of people with unfiltered disdain. There were also the issues. There was also the issues of the check is not immediate payment. The check has to be held until it clears, etc. And we'll get into details on that. So the committee reports. Here's the headline, The Morning Call, Paterson, New Jersey, Monday, August 11th, 1930. It says, Special Committee reports on payroll robbery problem. National Crime Commission told method other than cash must be used. Well, that's easier said than done. It's easier said than done because of the reasons we've just mentioned. The fact that the check cashing is a delayed process. There's mistrust of the banking system. As well, banks have a tendency to charge a small percentage to cash a check at that time, especially if the check is drawn on an out-of-state bank. Here are the issues that were identified, by the commission, and here are the issues that have formed the impediment to bringing along payment by check in the 1930s. The biggest issue is delay. Back then, every check had to be manually processed by hand. Check had to be examined by hand and entered into the system. The check must clear before funds are released. No bank is going to front you money, even if the check is drawn on the Ford Motor Company. In case a company goes under and the check is no good, the bank will never be held with a bad check. The check must clear before they release the funds. And to do that, they had to physically transport the check by truck, train, or in the late 1930s by airplane to either to regional clearinghouses or to a branch of the Federal Reserve. Typically, that would take 2 or 3 days for the check to work its way through the system and get back and cleared on a local check, but it would be 5 to 7 business days. So that's a week to a week and a half on a check that was drawn either further out of state or in another state. And if you were paid, most people were paid on Fridays at that point in time. They wouldn't even begin processing the check till Monday. It would be till Friday that you could access your own funds. Employees resisted the concept of being paid by check until after World War II. It wasn't until World War II, the late 1940s into the 1950s, that payment by check became a regular thing. Up until that point in time, it continued to be paid in a pay envelope with actual cash. One of the ways the federal government was able to encourage people to use payment by check was they got rid of the practice of charging a percentage, a 1% charge per se, on checks of out of state. They made it illegal, as it were, to charge those kind of commissions. Checks had to be cleared for the face value on there, and that helped to a great degree for the typical American to accept being paid by check. You know what's funny though? Banks and large depositors never had this problem of checks clearing. In 1915, it goes back that far. In 1915, the Federal Reserve, part of when the Fed came in 1913, part of what they did in 1915 was bring in a system called FedWire. Basically, it was a dedicated telegraph system that allowed for interstate banking to be done instantaneously by wire. So that if, let's just say, Ford Motor Company was building a plant in Pontiac, Michigan for $10 million, and the best rate that they could access was in a San Francisco bank, their bank, say the National Bank of Detroit, would just wire the bank in San Francisco with the details, and the funds, not the actual funds, but credit through the banking system would be forwarded back to, say, the National Bank of Detroit and forwarded immediately to Ford Motor Company. So the big shots, the Thurston Howell thirds of the world, never were bothered by this system, but the little guy was. And it wasn't until the 1950s, really with automated check processing, the invention of magnetic ink that allowed checks to be processed in the hundreds of millions weekly, and got the time down for all checks to be under 2 days for a check to clear. That combined with the not having to pay a commission to cash your check finally got the public on board in the 1950s. And it's because of guys like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the other assorted bad men that forced this issue, and they forced it for 50 years, that finally the banking system changed from cash to checks, and ultimately checks in the 80s to direct deposit, and then direct deposit then to electronic banking in the last 15 years. That, well, we're now at the ultimate end of basically where it was all beginning back with Butch and Sundance, moving towards a cashless society, initially to stop the robberies, but now, well, just for, several things. Convenience, better reporting for Internal Revenue Service, and better keeping an eye on everybody. In a surveillance state, if you're so inclined, in a surveillance state, there's nothing better than having all of your actions tracked, including all of your financial transactions, which is what's happening right now. Well, there we go. We've gone from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid all the way to a cashless society. I'm a little spent. Put in a lot of work here. I could use a paycheck. And that's exactly what we're going to get in our themed cocktail today. It's the paycheck cocktail. It's an interesting one. Starts with 3 dashes of absinthe, 2 ounces of gin, 1/2 ounce of triple sec, 1/2 ounce of dry vermouth, 1/2 ounce of Jagermeister, and 1/2 ounce of honey syrup. Honey syrup is just simple syrup, but using honey as the base instead of sugar. You do this one in a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 parts honey to 1 part water. That'll give this drink the sweetness. What you do, the absinthe is just going to go into a chilled coupe glass. Remember our favorite glass, chilled coupe glass is it's a 1930 champagne glass, wide top. You chill that sucker out, you put the absinthe in there, spin it around, discard the absinthe. Then in a tall glass filled with ice, you mix the other ingredients with your long spoon, strain that out into your now absinthe-lined coupe glass. You garnish with a twist of lemon. You can even go a little wild and flame that. If you twist with a match in front, you'll flame the acids as it come out. Gives it a little burnt flavor. Drop your lemon twist in there, and have yourself a paycheck, a well-deserved, a well-earned paycheck. Now, remember again to like and subscribe. Subscriptions are important for the development of the channel, and we'll see you again next week with another episode of the 100 Years or More Show. Take care, everybody.